Resentment doesn't arrive with shouting. It creeps in like damp rot. Beatrice sat at the mahogany dining table, listening to the agonizing chime of the grandfather clock. Edmund's soup had gone cold 20 minutes ago. When the heavy front door finally opened, he brought the smell of rain and another woman's lavender water into the hall. He didn't look at her. He didn't even apologize. That was the night the Duchess of Rothford decided to let the great estate bleed. Ink stained the pad of Beatrice's middle finger, a dark, permanent crescent beneath the nail. She rubbed it against her thumb, feeling the slight drag of friction before dipping the brass-nibbed pen back into the glass well. The study was freezing. It was a cavernous room wrapped in dark oak paneling that seemed to swallow the meager heat from the fireplace. She wore a heavy woolen shawl over her silk dress, the contrast of coarse thread against fine fabric a constant, irritating reminder of her current life. Rothford Abbey was dying. It was a massive, sprawling beast of stone and mortar that required constant feeding. It ate coal, it ate timber, and above all, it ate money. Beatrice's dowry had been the last substantial meal the estate had consumed, a vast fortune of industrial wealth poured into an aristocratic sieve. She turned the heavy parchment page of the ledger. The sound was dry, like dead leaves scraping across pavement. Repairs to the west wing roof, £400. Drainage for the lower pasture, £120. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, heavy, dragging slightly at the heel. Edmund. The door creaked open, admitting a draft that made the candle flames shudder and stretch. Edmund stood in the doorway, his riding boots caked in a thick gray mud that dripped onto the polished floorboards. His hunting jacket smelled of wet dog, damp wool, and beneath it, that faint, sharp floral scent. Lavender. It wasn't Beatrice's scent. She preferred the clean bite of citrus, something sharp to wake her up in the morning. Lavender was soft. Lavender was nostalgic. Lavender was Lydia. "You're still awake," Edmund said. His voice was a rich, warm baritone that had once made Beatrice's chest tight. Now it merely made her jaw clench. "The quarter-day accounts do not balance themselves, Edmund," she replied, not looking up. She deliberately kept her tone flat, bleeding any accusation from it. Accusations required energy she didn't possess. He moved into the room, bringing the chill with him. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid from the crystal decanter on the side table. The stopper clinked against the glass, a sharp, fragile sound. "You work too hard, Beatrice. Harrison can manage the numbers." "Harrison is a steward, not a magician," she said, finally raising her eyes. Edmund looked exhausted, but it wasn't the exhaustion of labor. It was the heavy, melancholic drain of a man caught in his own emotional web. His golden brown hair, usually immaculately swept back, hung limply over his forehead, darkened by the rain. He looked like a tragic poet. Beatrice felt a sudden ugly flare of disgust. "I was at the cottage," he said, staring into his glass. He didn't say Lydia's cottage. He didn't have to. The roof was leaking again. The storm. She was frightened. She's so terribly fragile since her father passed. Beatrice pressed the nib of her pen into the parchment. A black pool of ink bloomed, ruining a perfectly calculated column of figures. She felt a muscle tick in her cheek. She didn't feel the burning rage of a betrayed wife in a penny dreadful. She felt a profound, bone-deep annoyance. "I paid a mason to repair that roof 3 months ago," Beatrice said, her voice dropping a register. "With the funds from my personal account. It was a patch job," Edmund dismissed, taking a swallow of his drink. He turned to face the fire, presenting his back to her. "We grew up together, Beatrice. You must understand the bond. When I see her struggling in that little house, remembering how she used to run through the gardens here, I feel responsible." "You were supposed to marry her," Beatrice thought, the words sitting heavy and bitter on her tongue. "But her father went bankrupt, and mine bought a dukedom." She looked at his broad shoulders, the tailored cut of his jacket. She had tried, in the beginning. She had learned his favorite foods, memorized the names of his tedious cousins, and sat through endless dinners acting the part of the gracious, wealthy savior. But she could not compete with a ghost. She could not compete with the golden-hued memories of a childhood love that had never been tested by unpaid bills or failing crops. Lydia was a martyr in Edmund's eyes. Beatrice was just the bank. "Your boots," Beatrice said quietly, the silence stretching so long that Edmund finally turned his head. "What?" "Your boots. You're tracking mud onto the Persian weave, the one I imported." Edmund blinked, looking down at his feet as if surprised to find them there. A flash of irritation crossed his handsome face. "Is that all you care about? Carpets and columns of ink? A woman is sitting alone in the dark, terrified of a storm, and you are concerned about a rug." He set the glass down harder than necessary. "You have ice in your veins, Beatrice." He walked out, leaving the door ajar. The draft hit her immediately. Beatrice sat perfectly still, staring at the ruined page. She didn't cry. She simply reached for the sand shaker, poured a heavy layer over the wet ink to dry it, and closed the book with a resounding thud. Rent day dawned with a bitter frost that coated the manor's windows in thick, white rime. The great hall was a cavern of shivering stone. By 9 in the morning, the tenant farmers began to arrive, forming a queue that stretched out into the gravel courtyard. They brought the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and damp earth. Beatrice sat at the head of the long oak table, a ledger open before her, a heavy iron lockbox at her side. To her right, an empty chair with a carved crest sat vacant. Edmund's chair. "Next," she called out, her throat dry. A grizzled farmer stepped forward, his cap clutched in his rough, soil-stained hands. He placed a small stack of coins onto the table. The copper and silver clinked dully against the wood. The coins were cold and slightly damp from the sweat of his palm. 30 shillings, your grace," the man mumbled, his eyes darting to the empty chair before fixing on the floor. Beatrice counted the coins. Her fingers were numb. "You are short by 5 shillings, Mr. Hodges." "The frost took the late cabbages, your grace," he pleaded, shifting his weight. "His grace, he said last month he might offer a leniency." Beatrice paused, her finger resting on a worn silver shilling. "His grace is not here, Mr. Hodges, but I will note the deficit. You may pay it back after the spring thaw." "Thank you, your grace. Where is the Duke, if I may ask?" "He was detained by an urgent matter," Beatrice replied smoothly, her face a mask of polite indifference. But she knew exactly where he was. At 8 o'clock, a boy had run up to the estate with a message. Lydia's carriage had slipped a wheel on the icy road to the village. She wasn't hurt, merely stranded. Edmund had taken 2 grooms and the strongest team of horses, abandoning the estate's most crucial financial day without a backward glance. By noon, the lockbox was full, the ledger was closed, and the hall was empty. Beatrice sat alone in the silence. The cold had finally seeped past her woolen layers, settling deep into her bones. She looked at the empty chair beside her. She wasn't angry anymore. The simmering resentment had burned itself out, leaving behind a hard, crystalline clarity. He had made his choice. He had been making it every day for 3 years. He chose the damsel. He chose the romance of being a savior to a woman who demanded nothing but his affection, while Beatrice carried the crushing reality of his legacy. She stood up. Her joints popped in the quiet room. She walked up the grand staircase, her hand trailing lightly along the mahogany banister. She noticed the dust in the crevices of the carvings. The staff was shrinking. She had dismissed 3 maids last month to afford the blacksmith's bill. In her bedchamber, she pulled the bell rope. A few minutes later, her maid Jane appeared, out of breath. "Jane," Beatrice said, her voice steady. "Bring up the small leather traveling trunks, 2 of them." Jane's eyes widened, darting to the heavy wardrobe. "Your Grace? Are we going to London?" "I am going to London," Beatrice corrected. "You will accompany me. We leave in an hour." Packing was an exercise in brutal efficiency. Beatrice took no jewelry that bore the Rothford crest. She left the heavy velvet gowns that Edmund liked, the ones that made her look like a painting rather than a person. She packed practical wools, her sturdiest boots, and the linen nightgowns she had brought from her father's house. She opened the hidden compartment in her writing desk and withdrew a stack of banknotes. It was the remainder of her private allowance, the money she hadn't yet poured into the black hole of Rothford. It was enough to start over. It was enough to be free. She walked downstairs as the carriage was brought around to the front steps. The horses blew plumes of white steam into the freezing air. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the heavy iron-rimmed wheels. "Your Grace." Harrison, the steward, stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He looked from her traveling cloak to the loaded trunks. "The Duke. He has not returned. Should I send a rider?" "No, Harrison," Beatrice said, pulling on her leather gloves. The scent of tanned hide was sharp and grounding. "Do not disturb him." "But the accounts, Your Grace. The creditors from the city are expecting payment by Friday." Beatrice looked at the old man. She felt a brief pang of pity. "The ledgers are in the study, Harrison. I have updated them through this morning. As for the creditors, you will have to ask the Duke to manage them." She stepped out into the biting cold. The footman handed her up into the dark, velvet-lined interior of the carriage. It smelled of old dust and closed spaces. "Where to, Your Grace?" the driver called down. "The train station," Beatrice said. As the carriage lurched forward, Beatrice did not look back at the grand stone facade of the abbey. She looked down at her hands. The ink stain on her middle finger was still there, but for the first time in years, her hands felt entirely her own. Mud-caked Edmund's riding trousers drying into stiff, heavy plaques that dragged at his knees with every step. He handed his reins to a shivering groom in the stable yard, his mood foul. Lydia's carriage had indeed lost a wheel, but her subsequent hysterics had cost him half the day. She had wept into his velvet lapel, terrified of the ice, terrified of the wind, terrified of the darkening sky. He had held her, murmuring soothing platitudes, but for the first time in his life, the scent of her lavender water had given him a sharp, pinching headache. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the abbey. He expected the familiar wave of dry heat from the entryway hearth. Instead, the air inside was sharper and colder than the courtyard. "Peter!" Edmund barked, unbuttoning his damp coat. His voice slapped against the vaulted stone ceiling and died. No one answered. The great iron chandelier above hung unlit. Shadows clung to the corners of the grand hall like cobwebs. A profound, unnatural quiet suffocated the house. Usually there was the faint hum of industry, a maid sweeping a grate, the distant clatter of copper pans in the kitchens, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock. The clock, he realized with a sudden spike of irritation, had stopped. "Where is everyone?" he muttered, dropping his coat over a chair. It slid to the floor with a heavy, wet slap. He didn't pick it up. He strode toward the study, his boots loud on the floorboards. He expected Beatrice. He expected her to be sitting behind that massive desk, her spine rigid, her mouth set in that thin, disapproving line she had perfected over the last 3 years. He was ready for the argument. He had his defenses prepared. "My tenants needed me, Beatrice." A gentleman does not abandon a woman in distress. He pushed the study door open. The grate was completely dark. The air smelled of old paper, cold ashes, and dried ink. The desk was meticulously clean. Edmund stood in the doorway, a strange, hollow sensation blooming beneath his ribs. He turned and took the stairs 2 at a time, bypassing the gallery and heading straight for her bedchamber. He threw the door open. "Beatrice?" The room was freezing. The curtains were drawn back, letting in the pale blue light of the moon reflecting off the frosted lawns. Her dressing table was bare. The silver-backed brushes, the crystal bottles of citrus water, the small ivory box where she kept her mother's pearls, all gone. He walked slowly to the wardrobe and pulled the heavy doors wide. Empty wooden hangers clicked softly against each other in the draft. A single forgotten linen handkerchief lay on the bottom shelf. Your Grace. Edmund jumped, spinning around. Harrison stood in the hallway, holding a branched candelabra. The old steward's face was yellowed in the candlelight, the deep lines around his mouth sagging with an exhaustion that mirrored the decay of the house itself. "Where is my wife, Harrison?" Edmund demanded. His voice sounded thin. "Her Grace departed for the train station at 1 o'clock, Your Grace," Harrison said, his tone perfectly level. "She took 2 trunks and her maid." Departed?" Edmund scoffed, a nervous laugh punching its way out of his throat. "To where? Her sister's estate in York?" "To London, I believe, sir." "She is throwing a tantrum," Edmund sneered, dragging a hand through his damp hair. He paced the length of the empty rug, refusing to look at the gutted wardrobe. "She'll sit in a hotel for a week, realize how absurd she is being, and return. Have the fires lit. It's freezing in here." Harrison did not move. He shifted the candelabra to his left hand, and with his right, he produced a thick stack of folded parchment. "The domestic staff has been reduced to a skeleton crew, Your Grace," Harrison said softly. "Her Grace left no funds for coal for the main house. We have enough to heat the kitchens and the servants' quarters through the week." Edmund stopped pacing. "What do you mean, no funds? The rent was collected today." "The rent, Your Grace, amounted to £42 and 6 shillings. It is locked in the strong box in the study." Harrison stepped forward, extending the stack of papers. "These arrived by the afternoon post from the city. The butcher's account, the ironmonger, the slate supplier, and the promissory note from the London bank. They total nearly £600, due by Friday." Edmund stared at the papers as if they were venomous. He didn't take them. "Beatrice handles the creditors. Her Grace left explicit instructions," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "She stated she has surrendered the ledgers to your care. She will no longer be acting as the estate's financier." Edmund's chest tightened. The hollow feeling bloomed into a cold, suffocating panic. He snatched the papers from Harrison's hand. The seal of the London bank glared back at him, stark and red. He had ignored the mechanics of his own home for so long, assuming the gold simply flowed from her pen. He thought she nagged him out of a desire for control. He had never realized she was the only thing standing between him and absolute ruin. He looked around the empty room, the faint scent of her sharp citrus perfume completely swallowed by the smell of dust and winter draft. He had chosen to play the hero for a woman who needed a carriage wheel fixed. In doing so, he had lost the woman holding up the roof over his head. London smelled of sulfur, roasted mutton, and wet cobblestones. It was a chaotic, abrasive odor, and Beatrice inhaled it like fresh mountain air. She sat by the window of the leased townhouse in Mayfair, her hands wrapped around a porcelain teacup. The ceramic was piping hot against her palms. A roaring coal fire spat and hissed in the hearth, throwing aggressive, dancing light across the Turkish rug. She was not wearing wool. She wore a simple dress of dark green silk, light and unrestrictive. For the first time in 3 years, her toes weren't numb. A heavy carriage clattered past the window, the iron horseshoes striking sparks against the street. The noise was constant, a ceaseless, grinding hum of millions of people fighting for survival, wealth, and status. It was a beautiful racket. It was the sound of a world that didn't care about the fading prestige of a country duke. The parlor door clicked open. Jane entered, carrying a silver tray with a plate of buttered toast. "Mr. Carmichael is here, Your Grace," Jane said, setting the tray down on the low table. "Thank you, Jane. And please, just Madam, will do now," Beatrice reminded her gently. Jane bobbed a hesitant curtsy. "Yes, Madam." A moment later, a stout man with a severe gray mustache and a sharply tailored frock coat bustled into the room. He carried a leather satchel that looked as heavy as a blacksmith's anvil. "Your Grace," Carmichael said, bowing deeply. "Mr. Carmichael, have a seat by the fire. You look half frozen." Carmichael sat, extracting a thick sheaf of documents from his bag. The city is unforgiving this time of year, but I bring excellent news, all things considered. I have reviewed the settlement of your late grandfather's trust. Because it was held entirely separate from your father's primary estate, which formed your dowry, the Duke of Rothford has absolutely no legal claim to it. Beatrice took a slow sip of her tea. It tasted of bergamot and expensive honey. And the remaining balance? Sufficient, Carmichael said, his eyes gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of a man who loved numbers. More than sufficient. It yields an annuity of £3,000 a year. You will not live like a monarch, but you will live with profound independence. Beatrice set the cup down. She looked at her bare left hand. She had left the heavy gold band on the desk in the study at Rothford, right beside the inkwell. She still felt its ghost, a phantom weight pressing into her skin. "And the creditors?" she asked. Carmichael scoffed, a dry, papery sound. "They are swarming Rothford Abbey as we speak, I imagine. Without your personal signature guaranteeing the debt, the London banks have called in their notes. The Duke will have to liquidate assets, timber, land, perhaps the artwork. He is completely exposed." Beatrice looked out the window at the gray London sky. She felt a strange, jarring sensation in her chest. It wasn't guilt. It was the muscular memory of anxiety. For years, the mention of the estate's debts would send her rushing to her desk, terrified of the shame of bankruptcy, terrified of failing the legacy she had married into. Her brain was still wired to save him. She had to actively remind herself, "It is not my roof. It is not my mud. It is not my problem." "Let them swarm," Beatrice said quietly. Carmichael paused, looking at her over the rim of his spectacles. "There is one other matter. A letter arrived for you this morning by express courier, from the country." He reached into his satchel and withdrew an envelope. The parchment was thick, creamy, and stamped with a heavy pool of crimson wax. The Rothford crest, the boar, and the oak tree. Beatrice stared at it. She knew what it contained. Frantic apologies, promises of reform, perhaps even a pathetic attempt to weaponize his charm, to remind her of the few good months they had shared before Lydia's father died, and Edmund reverted to his childhood infatuation. He would be desperate. The creditors would be knocking, the fires would be out, and he would finally realize that Lydia's soft smiles could not buy coal. "Shall I open it, madam?" Carmichael asked, sensing her hesitation. "No." Beatrice stood up. Her silk dress rustled softly. She took the envelope from Carmichael's hand. The paper was stiff. The wax seal was cold and rough beneath her thumb. She walked over to the hearth. She didn't toss it in with a dramatic flourish. She simply held it out, letting her fingers loosen. The letter dropped onto the blazing coals. The thick parchment resisted for a second, smoking heavily, before a tongue of yellow flame licked up the side. The crimson wax melted instantly, bleeding into the ash like a fresh wound. She watched until the boar and the oak tree twisted, blackened, and crumbled into nothing. "I believe we are finished for the day, Mr. Carmichael," Beatrice said, turning her back to the fire. "I think I shall go for a walk in the park. I hear the winter air is quite bracing." Frost crept up the inside of the library windows, thick and opaque as spoiled milk. Edmund sat at the massive oak desk, wrapped in his heavy riding cloak, his breath pluming in the freezing air. His hands were numb. He gripped the edges of the ledger until his knuckles turned white, staring at the columns of numbers Beatrice had left behind. Her handwriting was sharp, elegant, and merciless. It cut across the pages like a surgeon's scalpel dissecting the rotting carcass of the Rothford estate. -600, -4,000, outstanding note at 8% interest. Edmund rubbed his gritty eyes. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His stomach churned with a persistent sour acid that tasted of copper and cheap wine. A sharp knock echoed against the heavy door, making him flinch. The sound was too loud in the hollow, empty house. "Enter," he rasped, his throat dry. Harrison stepped into the room. The old steward looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. His livery was brushed but threadbare at the cuffs. Behind him stood a man in a severe black woolen coat, carrying a leather folio. The man smelled of damp horsehair and city smog. "Mr. Croft, Your Grace," Harrison murmured, stepping aside. From the London Mercantile Bank. Edmund did not stand. He felt if he stood, his knees would buckle. "Mr. Croft, you've traveled a long way simply to deliver a piece of paper. I have traveled to ensure the paper is honored, Your Grace," Croft said. His voice was devoid of deference. He didn't look at the vaulted ceilings or the wall of leather-bound books. He looked at Edmund the way a butcher assesses a thin calf. "Your wife, the Duchess, has formally severed her financial association with this estate. The bank requires immediate repayment of the £4,000 principal on the South Acreage, plus interest, by Friday." Edmund swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "The harvest was poor. The winter has been brutal. I request a 6-month extension." "Extensions were granted on the strength of the Duchess's private fortune," Croft replied smoothly, opening his folio. The snap of the brass clasp sounded like a gunshot. "Without her collateral, you are a high-risk debtor. If the sum is not paid by Friday, we will begin the legal process of seizing the South Acreage and liquidating the timber." "You cannot seize Rothford land," Edmund snapped, a sudden desperate anger flaring in his chest. "My family has held that acreage for 400 years. "Then you should have paid for it, Your Grace." Croft placed a thick document on the desk. It landed directly over Beatrice's meticulous handwriting. "Friday. Good day to you." The banker turned and walked out, his boots striking the floorboards with rhythmic, merciless precision. Harrison lingered in the doorway for a moment, his eyes filled with a pity that made Edmund want to scream. Then he too quietly withdrew. Edmund sat in the freezing silence. He reached for the crystal decanter on the edge of the desk, but it was empty. He had drained it the night before. He let his head fall into his hands, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes until bursts of frantic color exploded in the darkness. Footsteps approached. They were light, uneven, lacking the heavy dread of Harrison's tread. A familiar scent drifted into the room, cutting through the smell of cold ash and panic. Lavender water. "Edmund?" Lydia stood in the doorway, bundled in a pale blue velvet pelisse lined with white rabbit fur. Her golden ringlets were perfectly arranged under her bonnet. Her cheeks flushed a delicate pink from the cold. She held a small wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. She looked entirely out of place in the grim, freezing study. She looked like a porcelain doll placed in a slaughterhouse. "The front door was unlocked," Lydia said, her voice a soft, melodic trill that grated against the pounding in Edmund's skull. "There was no footman. I had to let myself in. It is freezing in here, Edmund. Why is the fire not lit?" "We are out of coal," Edmund said flatly. He didn't lift his head. Lydia gasped softly, stepping closer. "Out of coal? But that is absurd. Simply send a boy to the village." Edmund finally looked up. He stared at her unblemished face, her wide, sympathetic blue eyes. For years he had found refuge in those eyes. He had seen them as a sanctuary from Beatrice's cold pragmatism, a reminder of a simpler, golden youth before titles and ledgers ruined everything. Now looking at her, he felt nothing but a profound, exhausting emptiness. "Send a boy with what money, Lydia?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "The village merchant requires coin. He will no longer accept my name on a chit." She blinked, confused. She set the basket on the edge of the desk. "I brought you scones. Cook made them this morning. I thought you might be lonely, with Beatrice gone." She said his wife's name carefully, as if it were a curse word. "It is terribly scandalous, Edmund. The village is whispering. You must fetch her back before she ruins your reputation entirely." "My reputation?" Edmund laughed. It was an ugly barking sound that made Lydia flinch and take a step backward. My reputation is the least of my concerns. The bank is foreclosing on the South Acreage on Friday." "Oh," Lydia said, her hand fluttering to her throat. She looked around the vast, freezing room as if expecting bags of gold to suddenly materialize from the woodwork. "Well, surely you can sell one of those dreadful old paintings, or perhaps borrow from your cousin. My cousin is bankrupt. The paintings are entailed to the title." Edmund leaned forward, resting his elbows on the ruined ledger. He looked at her hands, clutching the edges of her velvet cloak. They were soft, white, entirely uncalloused. There were no ink stains on her fingers. She had never stayed up until 3 in the morning, balancing columns of figures to keep a roof over his head. "My cottage roof is leaking again, Edmund," Lydia said, her lower lip trembling slightly. She was deploying the weapon that had always worked on him, her fragility. "The damp is getting into the parlor. I came to ask if you might send your mason." Edmund stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. He realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that she didn't understand. She was incapable of understanding. She was a parasite who had fed on his romantic illusions, just as he had been a parasite feeding on Beatrice's wealth. "I don't have a mason, Lydia," Edmund said, his voice dropping to a dead, hollow whisper. "I don't have a footman. I don't have coal. I don't have anything." Lydia's blue eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of empathy. They were tears of inconvenience. "You're being terribly cruel today, Edmund. I only came to comfort you." "Take your scones," he said, looking back down at the bank notice, "and go home." She stood there for a moment, waiting for him to apologize, waiting for the familiar dynamic to reassert itself. When he didn't move, she picked up her basket, her movements jerky and offended. "You are just as cold as she was," Lydia hissed, before turning and fleeing down the corridor. Edmund listened to the soft patter of her footsteps fade away. He was entirely alone. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, but the room no longer smelled of lavender. It just smelled of dust. Sunlight spilled across the polished mahogany of the breakfast table, catching the rim of a crystal marmalade jar and fracturing into a dozen tiny rainbows. Beatrice sat in the sunlit parlor of her Mayfair residence, reading the morning edition of the Times. She wore a loose morning gown of pale yellow silk, and her hair was pinned back with simple tortoise-shell combs. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans, hot butter, and the faint sweet scent of the hyacinths blooming in the window box. London agreed with her. The initial shock of her departure had rippled through society like a stone dropped in a stagnant pond, generating weeks of frantic gossip. But society's attention span was notoriously short, and Beatrice's wealth was notoriously solid. Without a husband to dictate her movements or drain her accounts, she had quietly established herself as an independent entity, respectable, wealthy, and entirely unbothered by the whispers. Jane entered the room carrying a silver salver with the Morning Post. She moved with a relaxed confidence she had never possessed at Rothford Abbey. "Just these two today, madam," Jane said, setting the letters beside Beatrice's plate. "Thank you, Jane." Beatrice picked up the first letter. It was from Carmichael, her solicitor, likely confirming the purchase of the railway shares they had discussed. The second letter was heavier, sealed with the discreet wax stamp of a prestigious London auction house. She sliced the thick paper open with a silver knife. She unfolded the catalog, her eyes scanning the crisp black type. She stopped. Her breathing did not hitch. Her hands did not tremble. But a strange, heavy stillness settled in her chest, a phantom echo of a life she had amputated. Property of the Duke of Rothford, to be liquidated at public auction. She read down the list, the Georgian silver service she had used to host 100 tedious dinners, the matching set of matched hunting geldings, the library's collection of first edition botanical prints, and finally, the crushing blow. A parcel of land comprising 4,000 acres of the South Estate, including the tenant farms and the timber rights. He was selling the land. Beatrice set the paper down next to her coffee cup. She looked out the window at the bustling street, watching a baker's boy balance a tray of pastries on his head as he dodged a passing carriage. She had expected this. Carmichael had warned her it was inevitable, yet seeing it printed in harsh black ink made it real. The grand, arrogant beast of Rothford Abbey was being butchered and sold for parts. She didn't feel triumphant. There was no soaring joy of vengeance. Vengeance implied she still cared enough to want him to hurt. Instead, she felt a hollow, cynical resignation. She had given him 3 years of her life and tens of thousands of pounds, trying to save a man who was determined to drown. He had chosen the soft, useless comfort of Lydia's lavender water over the hard, unyielding reality of survival. Beatrice picked up her coffee cup, taking a slow sip. The coffee was hot and bitter. She preferred it that way. She folded the auction catalog and tossed it into the wastebasket beneath the table. 200 miles away, the sound of a hammer echoed through the great hall of Rothford Abbey. Edmund stood by the massive stone fireplace, watching as 2 men in rough canvas aprons pried a massive oil painting from the wall. It was a portrait of his grandfather, the 3rd Duke, sitting astride a white war horse. The men grunted, their boots scraping against the bare floorboards. The Persian rug was already gone, rolled up and shipped to London 3 days ago. "Easy with the frame," the auction house representative barked, making a notation on his clipboard. "The gilt is chipping." The painting came loose with a terrible tearing sound. As it was lowered to the floor, it revealed a massive rectangle of unfaded crimson silk damask on the wall. The contrast between the brilliant protected fabric and the dingy, sun-faded wallpaper surrounding it was jarring. It looked like a raw, open wound. The air in the room was thick with a fine, gritty dust that tasted of chalk and decay. Edmund coughed, covering his mouth with a handkerchief. His clothes hung loosely on his frame. His cheekbones were sharp beneath his pale skin. He hadn't shaved in a week. "Right. That's the last of the portraits from this floor," the representative said, not looking at Edmund. To these men, the Duke of Rothford was not a peer of the realm. He was a failing business, a carcass to be stripped clean. "We'll move on to the library furniture next." "Leave the desk," Edmund said. His voice was cracked, barely a whisper. The representative looked up, his brow furrowed. "The oak desk? I'm afraid it's on the manifest, Your Grace. It's expected to fetch a decent price from an American buyer." "I said leave the desk," Edmund repeated, a sudden pathetic flare of defiance tightening his chest. "I have my orders, sir. To satisfy the creditors, everything on the manifest goes." The representative turned his back and walked toward the library, shouting instructions to his men. Edmund didn't follow them. He stood staring at the bright red rectangle on the wall where his grandfather used to be. He was paralyzed by the overwhelming physical weight of his failure. He had walked to the village yesterday, seeking Lydia. He hadn't been seeking comfort, just a familiar face in the wreckage. He had found her cottage door locked. A neighbor told him she had packed her bags and taken a coach to Bath to stay with an aunt, claiming the damp country air was ruining her constitution. She hadn't even left a note. When the money vanished, the romance died. Edmund turned and walked slowly up the grand staircase. His footsteps echoed in the barren house. The banister was stripped of its polish, feeling rough and splintered beneath his palm. He walked past his own chamber and pushed open the door to Beatrice's room. It was completely empty. Even the heavy velvet curtains had been taken down to be sold. The pale afternoon light illuminated the bare floorboards and the cold hearth. He walked to the center of the room and sank to his knees. The floor was hard and unforgiving. He pressed his face into his hands, trying to summon a prayer, or a tear, or even the energy to scream. But there was nothing left. The house was dead, and he was nothing more than a ghost haunting its empty halls. Rain lashed against the tall window panes of the Mayfair parlor, distorting the gas lamps on the street below into blurred yellow smears. Beatrice sat at her writing desk. It was not the massive, oppressive oak beast she had left in the country. This desk was a delicate piece of French walnut, narrow and elegant, placed specifically to catch the morning light. Right now it held a silver tea service, a crystal inkwell, and a stack of vellum deeds. She held a gold-nibbed fountain pen, a recent acquisition that did not leak or scratch. Her fingers were impeccably clean. The permanent crescent of black ink that had lived beneath her nail for 3 years had finally grown out and been filed away. Across the room, sitting stiffly on a damask sofa, was Mr. Reed. He was a land agent, a sharp-eyed, pragmatic man whose suit smelled faintly of stale tobacco and damp wool. He was nursing a glass of dry sherry, watching her with a mixture of professional respect and guarded curiosity. "The Surrey property is structurally sound, madam," Reed said, breaking the quiet. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. 200 acres, a modern drainage system in the lower fields. The manor house requires cosmetic updating, but the roof is entirely slate, less than a decade old. No rot. "And the tenant leases?" Beatrice asked, her eyes scanning the dense legal script of the contract. "Standard agricultural terms. They yield a reliable 8% return annually. It is a working farm, madam, not a vanity estate." "Good." Beatrice turned a page. The paper was thick, crisp, and smelled of the solicitor's office, a dry, dusty scent of sealing wax and old leather. "I have no interest in vanity. Vanity is a luxury I have learned to despise." She dipped the pen. She did not hesitate. She signed her name at the bottom of the deed, Beatrice Croft. She had dropped the title. The banks, the agents, the solicitors. They all knew her as the former Duchess of Rothford, but on paper, she reverted to the name that actually commanded capital. Reed stood up, setting his empty sherry glass on a side table with a soft clink. He walked over and collected the documents, sliding them into a leather portfolio. "A shrewd investment. You will take possession by the 1st of the month. Shall I hire a housekeeper to prepare the rooms?" "Yes, Mr. Reed. A practical woman. No footmen, no valets, just a staff large enough to keep the dust down and the fires lit." "Very sensible." Reed snapped the portfolio shut. He lingered for a fraction of a second, his weight shifting onto his left heel. It was the physical tell of a man holding onto a piece of unrequested information. Beatrice noticed. She always noticed the mechanics of a room now. "Speak, Mr. Reed. You are billing me by the hour. Do not waste my coin with hesitation." Reed cleared his throat, a dry, scraping sound. "I attended the final auction at the Rothford estate yesterday, madam, on behalf of another client seeking livestock. I thought you might wish to know. The proceedings are concluded." Beatrice leaned back in her chair. The velvet upholstery was soft against her spine. "Did the bank recover their principal?" "Barely. The timber rights sold for a fraction of their worth. A rush job by the liquidators." Reed adjusted his collar, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "The abbey itself remains unsold. It is deemed too expensive to maintain. The bank has boarded the ground floor windows and locked the gates. It is a dead property." "And the Duke?" Beatrice's voice was entirely level. She felt her pulse in her throat, a steady, rhythmic thumping, but it was not driven by heartbreak. It was a morbid, detached curiosity. She was asking about the fate of a stranger who owed her money. "He has vacated the main house, madam. The liquidators permitted him to occupy the old steward's cottage at the edge of the property. There is no staff. Even the old man, Harrison, I believe his name was, departed yesterday morning." Beatrice looked down at the silver tray on her desk. Beside the teapot sat a small folded note that had arrived 3 days ago. It was from Harrison, thanking her profusely for the train ticket to London and the position she had secured for him at her new Surrey estate. She had not saved Edmund, but she refused to let a loyal old man freeze to death simply because his master was a fool. "Thank you for the report, Mr. Reed," she said smoothly. "That will be all." After the agent left, Beatrice remained at the desk. The silence of the townhouse wrapped around her, broken only by the hiss of the coal fire in the grate and the patter of rain against the glass. She picked up her teacup. The porcelain was warm. She took a sip of the Earl Grey, letting the bergamot wash over her tongue. A lesser woman might have felt a twinge of guilt. A heroine in a penny, Dreadful might have ordered her carriage and rushed back to the country, her heart bleeding for the fallen aristocrat shivering in a damp cottage. But Beatrice was not a heroine. She was a survivor of a bad investment. She had watched Edmund pour his affection into a woman who vanished the moment the fires went out. She had watched him prioritize a phantom romance over the very real foundation of his own life. The steward's cottage was exactly what he had earned. Beatrice set the cup down. She pulled a fresh sheet of vellum toward her and began drafting a letter to a nursery in Surrey regarding the purchase of apple saplings. The past was a boarded-up ruin. Her future smelled of wet earth, clean slate, and quiet, absolute control. Blisters ruptured against the hickory wood of the axe handle, a sharp, wet tearing sensation that made Edmund suck in a breath through his teeth. He dropped the axe. It hit the frozen, rutted earth of the yard with a dull thud. He stared at his hands. His palms were raw, smeared with dirt and bright, fresh blood. The skin of his knuckles was cracked from the wind, the deep lines caked with grime. These were not the hands of a duke. They looked like the hands of a vagrant. A bitter gust of wind whipped across the barren fields, biting through his threadbare woolen coat. It was November. The sky was the color of bruised iron, pressing down on the world like a suffocating blanket. 50 yards away, the massive silhouette of Rothford Abbey loomed against the horizon. The great oak doors were padlocked. Planks of raw pine were nailed violently across the leaded glass windows of the ground floor. The house looked like a corpse with coins laid over its eyes. Edmund turned away from the abbey and looked at the piece of wood he had been trying to split. It was a knotty, stubborn chunk of elm he had dragged from the deadfall in the lower woods. He had swung the axe a dozen times, and the blade had merely bounced off, sending painful, vibrating shocks up his forearms. He was starving. A dull, hollow ache gnawed at his ribs, a persistent companion that made him dizzy when he stood up too fast. His last meal had been a heel of stale bread and a cup of cold well water 24 hours ago. He bent down, his knees popping loudly in the quiet air, and picked up the axe. The rough wood bit into his torn blisters. He gripped it tighter, welcoming the sharp sting. Pain was better than the numb, terrifying emptiness that waited for him inside the cottage. He swung. The axe head struck the edge of the log, glancing off and driving into the dirt. The jolt wrenched his shoulder. "Damn it!" he hissed, his voice cracking. It sounded pathetic, thin, and swallowed entirely by the wind. He dropped the axe again, abandoning the wood. He trudged toward the steward's cottage, his boots dragging in the frozen mud. The cottage was a squat stone building with a slate roof that was missing several tiles. It smelled perpetually of mold, damp ash, and mouse droppings. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. The main room was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through a single dirty window. There was a rusted iron stove in the corner, a rickety wooden chair, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. Edmund sank into the chair. It groaned under his weight. He rested his elbows on his knees, letting his bleeding hands hang limp between his legs. He looked at the empty stove. He needed a fire. The damp cold of the stone walls was seeping into his bones, stiffening his joints, but the effort required to go back out, retrieve the wood, and coax a flame from damp kindling felt insurmountable. 3 days ago, Harrison had walked into this very room, wearing his heavy traveling coat and holding a battered leather valise. The old man hadn't looked at Edmund with pity. He had looked at him with polite, professional finality. "Her Grace has offered me a position managing her new household in Surrey, Your Grace," Harrison had said, placing a single brass key on the table. "I'm taking the afternoon train. I have left half a loaf of bread and some tea in the larder. God save you, sir." Beatrice. Her name was a jagged piece of glass in his mind. He had spent months telling himself she was cruel, that she had abandoned her vows out of spite. He had clung to the belief that he was the victim of a heartless, calculating woman. But sitting in the freezing gloom, with the metallic taste of blood on his chapped lips, the self-deception finally fractured. He remembered her sitting at the desk in the great study, wrapped in a shawl, her fingers stained with ink, calculating the exact amount of coal needed to keep his ancestral home from freezing. He remembered her paying the mason from her own purse. He remembered her sharp, frustrated sighs when he brushed off her concerns to go ride with Lydia. Lydia. The name tasted like ash. When the creditors had come to board up the Abbey, he had written to Lydia in Bath, begging for a small loan, just enough to secure a room at an inn. Her reply had come a week later, written on scented pink paper. My dearest Edmund, my aunt's finances are quite restricted, and it would be utterly improper for me to involve myself in such sordid business affairs. I shall pray for your fortunes to turn. Yours, L. Sordid business affairs. That was what Beatrice had shielded him from. She had waded into the muck of reality so he could play the tragic, romantic lord. Edmund leaned back in the chair, his head hitting the stone wall behind him, the cold bit into his scalp. He closed his eyes. He was not a tragically misunderstood hero. He was a weak, entitled boy who had broken the only real thing he had ever possessed. He had chosen a porcelain doll over a pillar of iron, and now the roof had collapsed on him. A violent shiver racked his body, his teeth clattering together. He opened his eyes, staring at the rusted belly of the unlit stove. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair. His legs trembled. He wrapped a dirty rag around his bleeding right hand, tying it tight with his teeth. He walked back out into the biting wind, picked up the axe, and approached the knotty log. He didn't swing with anger. He swung with the desperate, ugly mechanics of a man who simply didn't want to freeze to death. Spring broke over Surrey, not with a gentle whisper, but a violent, muddy upheaval. The soil of Beatrice's new estate was a dense, loamy clay that smelled of crushed worms, ancient rainfall, and sharp green life. She knelt in the middle of the lower orchard, her muslin skirt ruined with dark, wet streaks. She plunged her bare hands into the earth. The dirt packed tightly beneath her fingernails, cool and rough, a grounding weight that tethered her to the present. She lifted a young apple sapling, its spindly roots exposed like nervous, pale veins, and settled it into the hole. She didn't wear gloves. She wanted to feel the grit. For 3 years she had touched nothing but dry parchment, brittle ledgers, and the cold, unyielding stone of a dying house. This dirt was different. This dirt yielded a return. Madam. Beatrice patted the soil firmly around the base of the sapling before looking up. Harrison stood at the edge of the freshly turned plot. He wore a crisp, dark coat, entirely unfrayed at the cuffs, and carried a silver tray holding a single, heavy envelope. The old steward looked rested. The deep gray pockets of exhaustion beneath his eyes had smoothed out, replaced by the quiet dignity of a man whose wages were paid on time. From Mr. Carmichael, madam, Harrison said, stepping carefully over a furrow to offer the tray. Beatrice wiped her hands on her coarse apron, leaving smears of brown mud on the white fabric. She picked up the envelope. The paper was thick. The seal of the London solicitor was pressed cleanly into blue wax. She cracked it open with her thumb, the sound a sharp snap in the quiet orchard. She unfolded the letter. It contained 2 concise paragraphs. Madam, I write to inform you that the final liquidation of the Rothford estate has concluded. As no buyer could be secured for the Abbey itself, the creditors have ordered the structure dismantled. The lead from the roof, the oak paneling, and the foundation stones are to be sold as salvage. Furthermore, the ecclesiastical courts have finalized the dissolution of your marital bond, citing irreconcilable abandonment of the estate's duties. You are entirely severed. Beatrice read the words twice. A brisk April wind swept through the orchard, rustling the bare branches of the older trees. She looked at the blue ink, dismantled. The great arrogant beast was being carved up for scraps. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. The hollow echo of Rothford Abbey was finally gone from her mind, replaced by the immediate, practical demands of the Surrey wind and the apple saplings. Will there be a reply, madam? Harrison asked quietly, watching her face. No, Harrison, Beatrice said, folding the letter and slipping it into her apron pocket alongside a handful of twine. There's nothing left to say. Tell the men to bring the water cart down. The ground is still too dry near the ridge. 200 miles north, a cold, sleet-driven rain battered the village of Rothford. The tavern, an ancient leaning building with a faded sign depicting a boar and an oak tree, smelled of wet wool, stale beer, and unwashed bodies. Edmund sat in the darkest corner, huddled near a sputtering tallow candle. He wore a heavy wool coat that had once been navy blue, but was now stained a mottled, greasy black. The collar was turned up against his gaunt, unshaven cheeks. His boots were wrapped in burlap sacks to keep the freezing mud from seeping through the cracked leather soles. He stared at the wooden table. Before him sat a cracked clay mug containing a half pint of the cheapest, thinnest ale the house offered. It was all he could afford after selling his last pair of silver boot buckles to the blacksmith. The tavern was crowded with farmers and laborers seeking refuge from the sleet, but no one sat near him. No one looked at him. A year ago, his entry into this room would have commanded total silence, a flurry of bows, and the innkeeper rushing to offer his finest brandy. Now, Hodges, the innkeeper, simply scowled when Edmund walked in, demanding the copper coins up front. Edmund wrapped his raw, scarred hands around the clay mug, trying to steal a fraction of warmth from the lukewarm liquid. His joints ached with a deep, persistent throb. He was 32 years old, and he felt like an old man. Two traveling merchants sat at the adjacent table, their voices loud and carrying over the din of the tavern. They were cutting into a thick mutton pie, the savory smell of roasted meat and gravy drifting into Edmund's corner. His stomach cramped violently. He clamped his jaw shut, swallowing the saliva pooling in his mouth. "Passed through Surrey on the way up," the stouter merchant said, wiping grease from his chin. "Sold 100 yards of fencing wire to a new estate down there. Remarkable operation. The fields are immaculate." "Surrey?" the other grunted, taking a swallow of ale. "Whose land?" "A woman's, believe it or not. A Mrs. Croft. Bought the old Fenwick place and turned it around in 6 months. Pays her accounts in solid gold on the day of delivery. They say she's a widow or divorced from some ruined northern lord. Hard to say. But she's got a head for iron and ledgers, that one." Edmund stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to ground glass. Croft. It was Beatrice's maiden name. He closed his eyes. The tavern noise seemed to fade into a dull, rushing roar, like a river flooding its banks. A sudden, vivid memory assaulted him. Beatrice sitting in the freezing abbey study, her shoulders rigid, begging him to look at the accounts, begging him to stop bleeding the estate dry for a woman who didn't even love him. He had called her cold. He had called her a calculator. She wasn't cold. She was merely holding the roof up while he was busy setting fire to the foundations. Edmund stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floorboards, but the merchants didn't even glance his way. He left the half-pint of ale untouched. He walked out of the tavern, pushing through the heavy wooden door into the biting sleet. The cold hit him like a physical blow, soaking instantly through his ruined coat. He dragged his feet through the thick, foul-smelling mud of the village street. He didn't walk toward the steward's cottage. He walked up the long, winding gravel drive toward the abbey. He reached the crest of the hill and stopped. The abbey was barely a skeleton. The grand slate roof was completely gone, exposing the heavy oak rafters to the gray, weeping sky. The leaded glass windows had been smashed out, the frames ripped from the stone. Scaffolding crawled up the sides of the ancient walls like a wooden infection, and piles of heavy square stones sat in the courtyard, waiting to be carted away to build a cotton mill in Yorkshire. It was gone. His legacy, his name, his home. Edmund stood in the freezing rain, his burlap-wrapped boots sinking into the gravel. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse the sky, to curse Beatrice, to curse Lydia. But no sound came out. He was just a hollow man standing before a hollow house, shivering in a storm of his own making. The ruin of Rothford Abbey wasn't caused by a sudden disaster, but by 1,000 selfish, willful choices. Edmund traded an empire for the illusion of a childhood romance, and that illusion vanished the second the fires went out. Did Beatrice's pragmatism make her cold, or simply strong enough to survive the wreckage? If this story of brutal consequences and hard-won independence kept you captivated, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep, atmospheric storytelling. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that loyalty must be earned, not expected. Drop a comment below. Who do you think was the true villain of the estate?